And with over a week to go before the much-talked-about G20 summit to be hosted on home soil, a lot has been said about what needs to be the priority when it comes to the discussions, and some of the issues that have been raised with the hopes that they will be on the agenda range from infrastructure, equality and climate change, amongst other things. And joining us now for a panel discussion on this are political analysts Angelo Fick, Director of Research at AUWAL Socio-Economic Research Institute, as well as Sanusha Naidu, a Senior Research Fellow at the Institute for Global Dialogue associated with UNISA. Thank you so much for your time, Angelo and Sanusha. And Angelo, I'd just like to start off with you. I mean, of course, so we know that the G20 summit will be taking place in South Africa. This is the first time it takes place on African soil. And when it comes to what this G20 should be about, what do you think this moment will signal for South Africa and for the continent?
So I think this is a moment in which the possibility of beginning to reimagine a global order out of the current disorder can be given the next step. So the global order has been under revision since 1990, and the order that emerged in the wake of the collapse of the Soviet Union has, over the last, shall we say, 10 years since Mr. Trump's first presidency of the United States, taken on new forms of development. And I think what we're going to want to see out of this G20 is what role in any potentially new institutions of the 2030s, and if we can even think ahead as far as the 2040s, the marginalized regions of the 20th century, Africa, parts of Asia and Latin America, are going to play in either reconfigured existing multilateral institutions or new multilateral institutions. And this takes us back to a moment where, like in the 1930s, the League of Nations came to the end of its lifespan in the wake of the Second World War. The new institutions that we now sit with as established over the last 80 years came into existence. And the question is, will we need a third world war, in which case we may not need institutions, or can we build new or reconfigured institutions without such a war?
And Sanusha, I'd like to come to you now. How important is Africa's positioning when it comes to this G20?
Well, I think to pick up on what Angelo is saying, I think the real challenge is the uncertainty of the current global architecture. We just don't know what it's going to look like in the next 10, 15, 20, or even 30 years. So we have projections around what global architecture will look like with China in terms of their economic development, their kind of driving force in both the global economy, but also in terms of shaping the architecture of the global financial system. But I think what we have to really understand is we haven't really reached this point in 1990, or even in the context of the fact that we don't know what it's going to be like in terms of the rules-based system, in terms of whether or not the institutions that we're asking or we're thinking about reconfiguration, will they reconfigure? But how will they reconfigure in the context of a multilateral system that's in a polycrisis moment? And to link Africa into that space, I think that the real issue is, how does Africa take this moment as being a member in the context of the African Union, as well in the sense of South Africa's hosting of the G20? What does it take forward in terms of how does it want to basically use its agency to kind of ensure that it's not sitting on the periphery and the margins? I think one of the points that we need to really think about right now was, what was 1990 with the so-called end of the Cold War, with the Berlin Wall coming down and the kind of disintegration or the disaggregation of the Soviet Union into other satellite states. But now I think we kind of at the G20 and asking ourselves is, the G20 was born out of crisis, 1997, 1998. Then, of course, it was elevated to a heads of state summit after the 2007-2008 financial crisis. Is it possible that the next coming crisis is going to be even more acute and intense? And how does the G20 deal with it? And how does Africa deal with it? Because there's 3 or 4 key issues that is under the G20 presidency of South Africa, which is critical for Africa. One is the cost of capital. which the president had referred to in terms of debt financing, and how much of that is taken away from development. Link that to the inequality report that's part of the Commission of Inequality that the president has put together, this panel expert, which has produced the inequality report, which links this to how you deal with the cost of capital and the debt. The third issue is critical minerals. And the fourth issue is climate change. All of this is critical to Africa if we are to think about the trends going forward.
Certainly. And Angelo, just touching on some of the issues there pointed out by Sanusha is the issue around reconfiguration, also talking about crisis mode. And when you look at where we find ourselves right now, can this summit be able to reshape the multilateralism system?
On its own, absolutely not. We have multiple proxy wars that some critics like Slavoj Žižek indicate is already the low-key version of the Third World War that's underway. And then we have great political instability in the most powerful, militarily as well as economically, most powerful state on the planet, the United States. There is domestic unease, and then there is also regional unease across a variety of spaces where the United States has fitted in. But let's not forget that the United States has always consistently established some of these multilateral institutions, including the IMF, the World Bank, the United Nations. These are all, institutions that were really pushed for by the United States after the Second World War, and often had the practice of these rules should apply to everybody else, but not to us. What we see in Donald Trump's position, both in his first presidency and in his current presidency of the United States, is that he's just taking that to a slightly more crude level of actually saying, as your package from Kailikla indicated, that he's simply going to thumb his nose at these and say, well, maybe, these states shouldn't be inside the G20. But he's operating as if there isn't a flux in the global space, with countries that will not have been powerful in 1990 having greater power now. So the way in which China has entered that space has shifted and reconfigured things. And yes, he might be right that the G20 may no longer be as useful as it was 20, 25 years ago. But at the same time, we've also seen over the last just 5 years an intensification of wealth accumulation for a very small minority, not even 1%. And that, I think, is the difference between now, 1945 and 1990, and also what is being proposed here is unsustainable precisely because something far more existential as a threat is what we're facing as humanity, and that is the unfolding climate catastrophe. Climate change is not happening in the future. Climate change is hitting us as we speak. And that, I think, may need an emergency intervention by the other 19 states who are still coming to this summit, because it is for humanity.
Thank you so much, Angelo. We are running out of time, unfortunately. And Sanusha, the last question will go to you. I mean, when we see this G20 finally take place, what should South Africa prioritize, particularly when it comes to advancing the interests of the African continent? Earlier on, I heard you talk about issues around debt and developing nations. What should be the priority for South Africa that will then impact the rest of the continent?
Well, I think the South African presidency has prioritized 4 areas. I haven't mentioned the issue of artificial intelligence, which is critical in the context of where Africa is as well. So I think these are key issues. One of the points I think we've got to bear in mind is that the Trump presidency takes on just 1 year. I think if we are to think about how to keep these issues on the agenda of the G20, but not just the G20. The G20 is one particular instrument of multilateralism. There are other issues and other instruments of multilateralism that need to be continued, like the COP, Conference of the Parties, which is currently happening in Brazil, which needs to interlink with these issues of climate change. So I think the challenge that we have is to keep the leverage of your agenda setting in the G20 beyond the G20, because the G20 also has to look at it in the context of what happens. There's no defining decision making that says, well, if Trump doesn't want the G20 or South Africa in the G20, it's not his decision to make. It is not one that's driven by an underwriting of the decision making, because it's a structure, but it's not formalized in the way that decision making is made. It's about consensus, adequate consensus, and then, of course, the question of whether you can come together on issues. So I think think about the G20 not just in the context of Trumpism or in the US, but beyond that, and keep that lever alive.
All right, Sanusha, thank you so much. Of course, so those are our guests there. Political analyst Angelo Fick, Director of Research at AUWAL Socioeconomic Research Institute, as well as Sanusha Naidu, Senior Research Fellow at the Institute for Global Dialogue, associated with UNISA. Thank you so much for your time this evening.